Hello, everyone. My name is Sahil Jain, and obviously the better one, of course. And today I'll be talking about mathematically modeling Parkinsonian neurons, specifically furthering our understanding of deep brain stimulation using global isochron portraits. Parkinson's disease, 10 million cases, no cure. Parkinson's is a neurodegenerative disease that affects motor control in human patients by basically affecting the basal ganglia, specifically the substantia nigra and the subthalamic nucleus. So here's a patient with Parkinson's, and what we see is that this elderly man has a hard time moving, and his hands shake in this tremor-like fashion. On the other hand, we have this patient, and it seems like the same guy, but suddenly he's able to move. And this is due to DBS, deep brain stimulation. And essentially, DBS is a treatment for Parkinson's disease. Deep brain stimulation really acts by inserting two electrodes in our brain on the right and left side and sending currents through our brain. And with these currents, we don't really understand why it works, but what happens is that we alter how our neurons work to make it so that we don't really have these poor motor control, and we can move our arms and legs efficiently again. But what are the issues with DBS? It seems like a great thing. First of all, battery. The battery for DBS is implanted in our human body, and this needs to be replaced every 2 to 3 years, surgically. Now, as you can imagine, that's a huge concern. No one wants to go through surgery every 2 to 3 years. Furthermore, this applies a high current in the brain. As you know, we don't want our brains being fried, and so this high current can be very deleterious and have permanent side effects. So the question is, can we reduce the amount of current applied and still make the same impact on our neurons to restore motor control? So to do this, we have to get a bit of basic background. And so to do this, we look at the neurons. Neurons fire like this. They start at this RMP, resting membrane potential, and they depolarize eventually. So basically our eyes, our hands, we all get these stimuli. And eventually enough voltage builds up until the neuron fires. Slowly the neuron comes, and immediately the neuron comes back to this threshold and it repeats. And this is what's called an oscillation with a periodic orbit. So neurons in the subthalamic nucleus, which is what we analyze, oscillate. And this is an animation I created to illustrate that point using my model. And so the neuron slowly comes up, it fires, and comes back down. Now, looking at oscillations more in detail. Now, I'm going to be talking about the stable limit cycle a lot. And what is the stable limit cycle? This is essentially the same thing as the previous animation showed, but that was voltage versus time, and this is sodium versus voltage. Now, why exactly do we care? What happens is when DBS is applied, we come off of this stable limit cycle. We perturb it by adding some voltage, and suddenly we're at this new point. And so what we did is we looked at DBS data. So using simulations, what exactly would happen when DBS was acting? And this is what happens. Instead of that nice, pretty picture, we get that crazy thing over there. And so we're pretty much off the stable limit cycle over here, and we eventually settle at this stable limit cycle rather than over here. And as you can see, the numbers are different. And so this is why it's important to understand why DBS works and how it works. So the model that I looked at specifically was a individual neuron model in the subthalamic nucleus. And this is what's called a conductance-based model. And what that essentially means is it's driven by electricity. And so it has 5 dimensions. That's a crazy equation over there, but we can pretty much simplify it by looking at 5 dimensions. So in the previous image, I showed voltage and sodium. There's actually also potassium, R, and calcium. And so using this thing called phase Molar reduction, what we can do is we can reduce all of these equations to a single formula over here, where we define all of these 5 dimensions as phase, or an angle. However, when DBS is applied, this equation doesn't really work. And so that's when our research comes in, which is with global isochron portraits. So the goal of our research is, can we find points that achieve the same end goal as DBS, but with smaller currents and closer to our limit cycle? And to do this, we map out global isochrons. Global isochrons tell us about the response of a neuron when we aren't on that stable limit cycle, as I showed earlier. So to do this, let's talk a little bit more about phase again. So phase is a way of defining the location of a point based on angle, rather than coordinates. Over here, all of you in a trigonometry class may have seen this image. This is a unit circle. Now, either we can define this point based on its 2 coordinates, root 2 over 2, root 2 over 2, or we can say it's a 45-degree angle. And we do the same thing for our stable limit cycle. So each of the points over here, assuming this is 0 and 2 pi, we can say this is pi, this is 3 over 2 pi, and furthermore. And we do this using this equation, which is a physics equation, saying that theta is equal to the angular frequency times time. So now we look at isochrons. What are isochrons and why do we care? Isochrons are points off of our stable limit cycle, as I showed earlier, that all converge to that same phase. So what we say is that even though you're off your stable limit cycle, you're eventually going to end up back on that stable limit cycle due to the dynamics of the system. And so can we map these out in a nice way and a visually meaningful way? So here's an illustration of an animation of what an isochron is. And so essentially, all the points on this line will end up together, moving together as time goes to infinity. This black point over here and this red point start differently, but eventually they become the same point. And this is essentially what an isochron is. So currently what current research involves is local isochrons, points which are very close to the limit cycle. What we seek to do is create global isochron portraits, expand it to the entire phase space. And this is so meaningful because it tells us the response when we have large perturbations, which is what DBS actually does. The first part was generating a phase response curve. And a phase response curve basically tells us what the neuron's response will be when we give it a very, very small current or very, very small perturbation. And you may say, this is exactly what's already been done. And yes, so what we did is we first modeled what's already been done to see if those results align with our model, and they did. What we saw is that most of the time, if you gave it a very, very small perturbation, nothing would happen, except when you're about to fire. If you're about to fire and you suddenly give it the voltage it needs to fire, we create a large phase response. And this phase response curve is the z of theta in our phase model reduction. Generating a global isochron portrait. So this is where our research actually comes in. And so the initial strategy was, okay, we can't really visualize 5 dimensions, so let's just consider 2 of them. Arbitrarily, I thought that maybe voltage and sodium are probably the most 2 important parts of a neuron, since that's what I'd heard. So to generate my isochron portrait, I sampled random points, voltage and sodium, off the stable limit cycle. I kept all the other variables constant, and I simulated the points for 3 periods and found the resulting phase. The problem with this, though, is that other channels are also changing, and so we can't really truly simulate the dynamics of our model by just considering 2 of the variables. When we considered 2 of the variables, what we saw is that we saw these clusters, and these clusters indicate all these points end up at the same phase. And while this may seem cool, when we later looked at the results, the points were only ending up at 2 pi and 0, which means we weren't really getting to all the phases in our model, and this wasn't an accurate simulation or an accurate representation of the 5-dimensional system we were looking at. So then we decided, okay, why don't we just look more at the individual variables and see if we can create some relationships between them. So we looked at voltage, sodium, potassium, R, and calcium. And we created a covariance matrix, which basically tells you how related 2 variables are. And 1 means that they're almost perfectly related, and 0 means they're completely unrelated. And so you see that these numbers, some of them are quite high, like 0.8374, but nothing too significant that we can actually make reasonable predictions. So no significant relationships found. So we looked into the dynamics of the system further. We said, can we look at the individual amount of current that each variable provides? And what we saw is, as per our expectations, voltage, sodium, and potassium provide a lot of current. Calcium also provides a significant amount, but what's really interesting is R provides a rather insignificant amount of current. So what we can deduce from this is that even if we predict this with some reasonable amount of accuracy, this shouldn't really affect the overall dynamics of our system. So we picked R, and we decided we're going to predict it. Even if it's not perfectly accurate, we can still model our system reasonably accurately. Then we looked at the rate of evolution of our variables. So as you can see, R starts off over here super high. And this is when DBS is applied, deep brain stimulation. And as soon as you turn DBS off, it immediately crashes back down to its stable limit cycle within milliseconds. However, calcium, on the other hand, takes ages to come back to that same stable limit cycle. And we can use this to our advantage by saying, in our global isochron portrait, we can consider calcium to stay constant within a couple limit cycles. So we redefined our strategy. We simplified our 5-dimensional model to visualize isochrons in a 3-dimensional space. So we had our five dimensions, voltage, sodium, potassium, calcium, and R. We realized that calcium between limit cycles varies very little, so we eliminated that. Next, we consider 4 more variables. We predicted R using a feed-forward neural network. And although this wasn't perfectly accurate, since we showed that R contributes so little to our current, we can pretty much approximate this without affecting the accuracy of our simulation too much. So this was our 3-dimensional space, and this is how that stable limit cycle looks. So what were the results when we plotted our global isochron portraits? Well, what we saw is basically these scatter plots, and each point, basically each color represents that all those points ended up at the same phase. This is the color bar representing that. And so what we saw is that over here at the right region of our graph, these points pretty much ended up all at the same phase. It gets a little more interesting in the left region, though, where it's a lot more spread out. And so what we can use this portrait to do is we can deduce when a neuron is, where in our neuron we should apply current and where we shouldn't. So what we saw is these are 3 different graphs of the same isochron portrait, but for different values of calcium. And so what we saw is these isochron portraits in their phases shifted with color. So essentially, as you change calcium, the phase color shifted. However, they retained their structure. And we can use this and say that this is meaningful because now we know that although changing the variables in our system could somewhat alter the way our neuron works, it retains that structure. And we can use this structure to determine how a neuron can act when we give it a finite perturbation. It shows the dependencies, but also the consistencies within the dynamics of a neuron. So isochrons in action. Can we actually show that these work? Well, here are 2 points, and they're clearly different points, and they're off. What happened when we simulated for 3 periods is they ended up at the same phase. And here's an animation that shows that. As you can see, they were separated at one point. Eventually, they come back to the same point. And this is just 2 points. We had 3,000 points over there, and so we were able to deduce clearly which points would end up at the same phase. And so what's the significance of all this? Why does it all matter? Well, for any point, we can now estimate the isochron, or the phase that this point will end up on. We can predict a neuron's response in efficient matter. We no longer have to stimulate the neuron for a certain number of periods. Instead, we can just say, here are the initial conditions. What will the phase be based on looking at the neighboring points and what their color was? We can design control systems where we find the optimal minimum current to apply based on a certain phase. So we can say, okay, what DBS does is it adds a finite perturbation to send our neuron to a different phase. We can now model this, but with smaller currents. We can say, okay, here's a neuron, and here's a point that it's on. What's the closest point or the closest isochron that we want to send the phase of it to? So with that, I would like to conclude my presentation by acknowledging some key people. First off, my mentor, Timothy Machin, who's been very supportive. Rishu Mahanka, who's been a great collaborator. Bharat, Daniel, and Jacob, who've been great in advice. Professor Jeff Molis, who's really been there to give a lot of advice to us and feedback. Dr. Kim and Sean Kerr for organizing the program, thank you. Sarah Grindine for being a great TA. Summer Discovery. And lastly, my parents and my brother in the back for being there for me always. Thank you.